Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. We've got an excellent interview for you today with the author Damien Lewis, who is the writer of numerous books on the Second World War, and today he's come to talk about the SAS, Britain's development of special forces during the war, and his new book SAS Great Escapes 2, which has been born of some really extraordinary research with the last surviving members of the SAS, the Second World War SAS, and their family members, and some really heartrending stories of war, of trauma, and of survival. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you Damien Lewis, and to join Damien in this fascinating conversation. Thanks very much. Okay, fabulous. Well, welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. I'm delighted to introduce Damien Lewis, the author of SAS Escapes. Is it SAS Great Escapes 2? Oh,
that's right, yeah.
Right. Okay. And there, I think there's a huge number of things to kind of talk about. We normally have about kind of 40 minutes or so. So we'll try to pack as many of these kind of questions in. But obviously this talks about the SAS of most people's kind of popular imagination, except for the fact that there was a TV show, a very daring kind of Peaky Blinders sort of TV show about them on earlier this year. Most people, when they conceive of the SAS, think of a modern special force. They think of counterterrorism and that kind of thing. But really, that's a small part of the story of the SAS.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps we could begin about talking about where they come from, and the concept of special forces and where that arises from.
Sure. So you really have to trace it back to June 1940, Britain's darkest hour, defeat in Dunkirk. And Churchill, admirably facing what looked like almost certain defeat in the face, staring defeat in the face, and with all his politicians and military advisors saying we had to roof these islands over and just concentrate on defence, he basically refused and said, no, we have to have offensive operations. We have to strike back. And if nothing else, we have to do so for the morale of the British people, to show we have the will to fight, and to demonstrate to our American friends, who we hope will join us in the war eventually, that the British bulldog is not down and out. So the means that he conceived of to do so, along with a very colourful, brilliant character in the war, Colonel Dudley Clark, who became the Grand Master of Deception later in the war. But the two of them together conceived of the concept of the commandos. Well, actually, special duty volunteers, or volunteers for hazardous service. So these were volunteers who would step forward to do the kind of small-scale raids that they envisaged, and what would eventually become the commandos. And at that stage, they had no equipment, no training. No one had ever done this before, and it was based largely loosely upon the idea of the Boer commandos from the Boer War, who were, these South African farmers who rode their own horses, dressed in their farming clothes, carried their own weapons, and 25,000 Boer commandos caused 300,000 British soldiers in the British Army a very serious amount of problems in South Africa. Dudley Clark had seen that at first hand. He was brought up in South Africa. Churchill had reported from the Boer War and been captured by the Boers and escaped. So both of them had this real intimate experience with what the Boer commandos were like, and that was the concept that they bring to fruition in Britain in the beleaguered summer of 1940. Of course, there was immense resistance within the British military hierarchy in particular, because the Boer commandos were irregular, maverick guerrilla soldiers who didn't even wear uniforms, didn't particularly suit their officers. It was antithetical to most of what the British Army was about at the time. But, with Churchill's backing, the Special Service Volunteers became a, several thousand strong force very quickly. And then, you fast track from there into the summer of 1941, and the war is going extremely badly on all fronts. And in particular in North Africa, we are pretty much staring defeat in the face from General Rommel's Afrika Korps and the Italian forces. And David Stirling, the founder of the SAS, and one or two others conceived of because the desert is so particular, it's so peculiar in terms of theatre in which to fight. Huge, massive open spaces, long extended supply lines. It lent itself perfectly to those guerrilla-style operations, and so they conceived of a desert force which could initially parachute in deep behind enemy lines and perpetrate mayhem and murder on their supply lines in particular, but also their outfields. And that was then that's what led to the birth of the SAS, which grew out of this whole special volunteer cadre.
And I'm guessing, as is so often the case in war, that learning these sorts of tactics and skills was a lot of trial and error.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, the first ever mission by the SAS, which was Operation Squatter, which was in the autumn of 1941, where they parachuted in 5 groups, 5 patrols parachuted in 5 aircraft, flew in 5 aircraft to parachute in and destroy 5 enemy airstrips to a rigid timescale, which was supposed to correlate to a Allied offensive. And lo and behold, the day they were flying in, unbelievably, a desert storm blew up and there was ferocious winds and torrential rain. The last thing they were expecting. But they went ahead anyway because it was to a rigid timescale. They had to go in, and it was an utter disaster. I mean, of the 60-odd men who deployed, only just over 20 came back, and the rest were all, blown to the 4 corners of the desert or killed upon dropping into that terrain. And so they learned from that lesson. And what they learned was, parachuting wasn't a particularly wise idea in terms of desert operations. But of course, the long range desert group, the desert reconnaissance specialists, were already there on the ground with their Chevrolet trucks, traversing the desert, taking intelligence missions, carrying out observation missions as well. And so they then became the taxi service via which the SAS were delivered to and taken back from their targets. So, yeah, it was very much a process of making up as they went along by trial and error.
Yeah. And I suppose in those first years of the war, because of the defeat in France, all the sort of strategic assumptions that the British Army had, and the French, obviously, who were meant to be our partners and are defeated, those, in the summer of 1940, all those strategic assumptions are torn to shreds. And so you sort of have to make it up as you go along, to some extent. It's interesting you mentioned that part of the development of not just the SAS, but of the kind of the commando idea was about showing the Americans that we were still in the war. Mm-hmm. How significant a factor do you think that was? I mean, do you think that in Churchill's thinking particularly?
Massive. I think Churchill rarely made a decision, certainly in early stages of the war, the first 2 years of the war, you could argue without a mind to America, without a shadow of a doubt. And you could argue that, the actual material impact of the commandos in particular on, German forces, the course of the war was negligible, pinprick rage, you could argue. But in terms of those 2 factors, the morale of the British people and convincing Roosevelt that we were in the fight, invaluable. You cannot place a value upon it. Just to give you one example, the first ever raid by the commandos was Operation, the name escapes me, I'm sorry, but it's what happened was in June 1942, Dunkirk happens, Churchill backs the formation of the commandos and he says, I want the first raid back across the channel by the end of the month. Now just imagine the challenges involved. You've got no trained people, no one's ever done it before, you've got no equipment, no weaponry, but they did it. They got 90 guys back across the channel in RAF crash boats, which are not, particularly great landing craft. They landed on the beach, they raided a German position, seized some prisoners. Of infinitesimal importance in terms of the wider fortunes of the war. But at that moment, when they came back and they were successful, and those headlines hit the British press, imagine the morale and propaganda value in Britain. And then, of course, those headlines were repeated across the Atlantic in America. The British Bulldog finds its mark. That's a huge part of what it was about. Churchill was very canny. He wasn't just, a stubborn and brave and determined to do the right thing, but he was also extremely canny and smart. He knew what he had to do to try and maneuver America into the war, but also to give Roosevelt the excuse he needed, because Roosevelt wanted to join Britain and the Allies. Don't forget, he was mustard keen. He just needed a reason and an excuse, and Churchill was providing that.
Yeah. And later on in the war, I mean, the development of American special forces, things like the U.S. Rangers and things like that, are kind of a direct product of
Direct,
all the
abs-
lessons.
absolute direct pedigree. So, the first American Special Operations Force, which you could argue was the Office of Strategic Services, which was the forerunner of the CIA. It became the CIA after the war, was formed based 100% on the British SOE, the Special Operations Executive, which was the kind of sister wing to British Special Forces.
Mm-hmm.
Those the SOE was formed to do all the things you're not allowed to do in war: assassinations, bribery, corruption, money laundering, whatever it might be. Because Churchill rightfully believed we had to fight the war as a total war, no holds barred, on every front, because he knew Hitler would as well. And so, when Wild Bill Donovan,
Mm-hmm.
head of what became the head of the OSS, wanted to work out how to form it. He came to the UK, went through UK training courses, and was basically given the chapter and verse on how we had formed the SOE and our own special forces. So it was absolutely based on the same model. In fact, it wasn't just based on the same model, but they also had, they co-located individuals. So individuals from the SOE and British Special Forces were sent to the States to actually work alongside their counterparts and build that organization up. And that, by the way, started happening before Roosevelt officially got America to join the war.
Right, right.
So this is high stakes stuff.
So I mean, there's some fascinating kind of inter-service connections across the Atlantic that I think go sort of slightly unrecognized a lot of the time. I mean, you often the focus is often on sort of the slightly snooty things that American generals said about the British from time to time, but there's actually a huge amount of cooperation and knowledge sharing, and of course America. I mean, the one thing I think that is kind of difficult to kind of really sort of imagine is that the unpreparedness of American forces in in
Yeah,
1939, 1940, there was nothing to speak of, really.
nothing at all. And especially in this field, in the field of intelligence gathering, foreign intelligence gathering special forces, they had nothing. So they had to base it upon the British model.
Yeah.
And, it's all credit to, British government and intelligence services in particular, that they were willing to share really their innermost secrets and their innermost workings to enable the Americans to get up to speed, without which, America's entry into the war would have been later, you could argue, and certainly when they entered the war, they would not have been so prepared. So this was crucial. And of course, then the Rangers, which were the American version of the commandos, and all their special forces came to the UK, in 1943, late 1942, to be put through exactly the same training courses that our guys were put through, and then go off and do their own operations. So that relationship could not have been closer.
So let's talk a little bit about the writing of the book. Were you kind of in I read in the fortunate position of having sort of contact with sort of veterans and families and that sort of thing. Obviously, there aren't many left now. But talk us through a little bit of the process of research. How did you find these incredible stories?
Yeah, sure. So I did interview one of the last survivors of the SAS, one SAS, a chap called Alec Borry. And the reason I really want to make mention of him is that, incredibly sadly, he died about 3 or 4 days ago.
Oh, right.
So I interviewed him about, I don't know, a few months ago. And, that was a real privilege, as you can imagine, and was very useful for writing the book. And sadly, he's just passed away. So capturing these stories from the people who were there, these are the last years in which we can do so. That's a really, really important point to make. And then over and above that, I've had incredible cooperation and help and support from the families of those who deployed. So that's opening their family archive, telling the stories of what their father told them, all the things that without which these stories almost could not be told. But the really interesting thing is, this is where it gets kind of quite emotional, is that in several of these stories told in SAS Great Escapes 2, the daughter of the man portrayed, for example, in the last story, Herbert Castello, Avro Castello, his daughter, basically said to me in a very emotional, communication. They said, look, I've learned things about my father and his escape, which I never even knew. And, it's been such a hugely emotional learning journey we've been on. Of course, I learned a lot from her. For example, her father used to have, every full moon he would have a nightmare. He'd wake up in the middle of the night with nightmares because they would deploy on operations on the full moon. It was called the moon window, when you could see enough to actually parachute into enemy territory. But she told me, every full moon he would wake up in the middle of the night, bathed in sweat and screaming and having nightmares. And she would, as a young girl, would go into his room and mop his brow. And he never spoke about the war. So many of these men didn't. No. But he would just mention a few things when she caught him in that moment. So, for example, one time she said, "What's that scar on your side?" He said, "That's a bullet wound. That's where the German shot me." And then he had all these marks on his chest. She asked what those were. He said, "That's where the Germans, when they captured me, tortured me with electrodes." So, really, really intimate, sharing of really, really intimate emotional material like that. And then her reaction to some of the things she didn't even know about her father, which I had written about and revealed in his Great Escape story. And that experience was replicated through several of the tales told in the book. And I think that's the joy of writing these stories, partly.
Yeah.
Is if you've done your job properly, it becomes an emotional journey, and it draws you very close to the families of those you portrayed.
Well, I mean, I guess firstly, if you've been someone that served on the most classified of missions, and it's I remember John le Carré talking about how even though he was totally disenchanted with intelligence and very jaded, he says there's certain things you never talk about because that's that was your duty and your pledge. And also all that, again, trauma, huge amount of terrifying and stuff, and also, witnessing all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So, and the inability to pass that on to your families, and I guess the ability of family members then to be able to tell you the story has a kind of a very powerful effect, and probably something very good for them too, to be able to kind of share that eventually. And you're right in that there is this generation of people who have lived these kind of incredible these incredible experiences, and that are now kind of all dying out. So it's really great that you've managed to capture that. Perhaps we could talk about a couple of the escapes. What stood out for you as the kind of the most kind of, I suppose, unlikely survival story, if you will?
Most unlikely, probably two actually. I mean, actually, all of them. And that's a terrible answer, but they're also unbelievably extraordinary. That I think in every one there comes a moment where you just don't believe they're going to make it through, or an individual's going to make it through. Just the first story. Bill Fraser, Lieutenant Bill Fraser, who was this archetypal figure in the SAS all through the war. A real standout figure. If there was one single SAS raider who kind of rivaled Colonel Blair Paddy Mayne, who was, the raider without compare, who went on to command the SAS for the war, it would be Lieutenant Bill Fraser. And they, of course, were very close for much of the war. But Bill Fraser, on his second ever mission, his first mission is wildly successful. Destroys 37 enemy warplanes on the ground, and when he comes out in his report, he laments the fact that they left 2 behind. That's the main focus of his report. Not, gee, we got 37. It's like, oh yes, well, we left 2 behind. That's annoying. Brilliantly underspoken Scot, and but on his second mission, they get the long range desert group patrol that's supposed to pick them up gets shot up by German aircraft, and only one vehicle survives, and they're limping home. And obviously, they can't pick up Fraser and his party, and so they then have several hundred miles to cross of enemy territory in the middle of the Sahara Desert with no water and no food, hunted by the enemy all the way on foot. Now, obviously, you don't stand a chance, you would imagine, wouldn't you? Mm-hmm. And yet, pull it off. And the means by which they do so are just, Yeah, if you wrote that as a fiction, if you wrote that story as a thriller, people wouldn't believe it. And that's the
No.
great thing about these tales, is that they are truth is stranger than fiction, and these all have that element to them. And it's testimony to the absolutely unyielding spirit of these individuals who are drawn to these special forces units,
Yeah.
that they had this absolute determination to get back to their unit and carry on the good fight. And I think that's really important to emphasize. Whenever you speak to people who, as I have done, some of the guys who actually got away, you might imagine, for example, their driving desire to escape would be to defeat the Nazis or to fight for Queen and country. Actually, when you ask them what really drove them to escape and get back to their unit, it was because they felt guilty about not being there alongside their brother warriors fighting shoulder to shoulder with them. That's a really important point.
Yeah.
That esprit de corps that the SAS forged and other units like it was so strong and so powerful, and the brotherhood so overarching and so binding, that those who were in a POW camp, reasonably safe and secure, actually, I mean, it weren't great conditions, but it wasn't, you weren't about to die at every moment. They felt guilty, and it was the guilt and the need to get back to fight alongside their brothers that drove them to escape again, even knowing if they were caught, what would happen to them.
Yeah. So that's some quite extraordinary sort of mindsets to be in. And I just wonder, when you look at members of the SAS, are there sort of unifying features between them that kind of sort of give us a clue about the sorts of people that volunteered for these kinds of suicide missions very often?
Yeah. I mean, suicide missions is not. That's not an over-exaggeration. The Second World War in particular, an awful lot of them were, and sometimes they refer to them in that way. There are unifying features. I mean, it's kind of almost counterintuitive, but so I'm trying to give you an example that will make it easy to understand. So, for example, if I were an officer and you were one of my men, and we were going to spend the next 3 months on a desert raiding operation, I can't exactly order you to follow my orders, and because it's such an extreme thing to do. The only way you could actually command and lead people in that situation was by inspiration and by example, by making people feel they were part of something absolutely special and unique, and that the cause gelled everybody and welded everyone together, united, all for one for all. So there's this concept of transformational leadership, which is well recognized today. It wasn't really recognized in World War II, but this is kind of where it started. And the idea is that you don't lead by dint of rank. You don't lead by ordering people. You lead by example and by inspiring them. And that is the only way you can get them to go into these absolutely suicidal situations where the chances of getting out are almost zero. You can only do that in that way. You can't order soldiers. It doesn't work. I mean, you're away for months on end in the desert in small bands of men. They've got every opportunity they want to bump you off as their officer and just return home. You can only command in that way. And I think to do that, and the way that somebody like, Colonel Blair Paddy Mayne or other standout SAS commanders did in the war, you have to have certain aspects to your character. Of course, you have to be a brilliant warrior. You have to be, a fantastic tactician. But more than anything else, you have to have imagination and empathy.
Yeah.
You have to have imagination to be able to think, to conceive of missions which are so off the scale of the enemy's radar. They're never going to imagine you would attack in that way. That's the first thing. Really, you've got to be able to think the unthinkable. And the second thing is you need empathy, because you've got to be able to build a relationship with the men under your command so they would follow you into the jaws of hell itself and back again, and still think that, that they had a chance of surviving. And that's what, if you read the accounts of all the originals who served alongside Paddy Mayne, who's a great example of this, they all say, for whatever reason, when we were under his command, no matter what the stakes we were up against, no matter how terrible things looked, we always believed he had the ability to bring us back again alive.
Does David Stirling kind of rack up in the same line? Because there are kind of mixed sort of, shall we say, revisionist views of David Sterling have kind of emerged in the last 10 or 20 years or so. I mean, what's your sense of him?
Sterling was another utterly exceptional character, but different. So the best way to sum it up, in terms of Sterling and Maine, for example, David Lloyd Owen, who was one of the LRDG officers, he said they were the perfect combination and terrifying in their effect, that Sterling and Maine. The reason being, Sterling's brilliance was his flights as fancy, his imagination. He conceived of the unit in the first place. He's the guy who had the intellect and the powers of imagination to think such a unit might be possible and what it might do. Mm-hmm. And then he also had the charm and the context to operate on high at the higher level to protect the SAS because it had so many detractors and so many enemies.
Yeah.
And then Maine was the man who at the coalface went out and made the raids happen and made the 100 aircraft get destroyed in a few weeks, and who actually drove the men forward on the front line. And that's why they were this brilliant combination. In a sense, you could not, in the early days, you could not have had one without the other. They were essential to the two of them.
The kind of Jagger and Richards of special forces,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I guess it's interesting, isn't it? You talk about these sort of institutional sort of pressures where it's established military and senior military people who think I don't understand what this is. I don't understand why we're doing it, and I would probably like it to go away or defund it or shut it down. And when did the tide turn for people like Sterling? I mean, by the end of the war, the special forces are an established fact. When did they win the argument, do you think?
They never won the argument during World War II. They were always unpopular and always on sufferance. Let's put it that way. The thing about them was they were very successful in what they did. So their detractors, felt threatened by them more than anything else, because success breeds envy, and it makes people in positions of higher command who don't understand this new way of fighting war feel insecure. That was the big problem. But you got to remember that, October 1945, the SAS is disbanded. As Alec Borry, the veteran I mentioned, who sadly just passed away, said to me a few weeks back, he said, look, they couldn't wait to get rid of us, because we did our own thing in the way we knew how to do it, and we didn't really take much notice from our detractors from on high. So, the desire to get rid of the SAS was there throughout the war, and it never went away. And it was that they were disbanded in October 45. They were then reformed, several years later for the Malaya emergency. Mm-hmm. Really, you'd have to kind of look more recently, I would guess, kind of the Iranian embassy siege time, when they came out of the shadows into the public conscious and became this kind of military brand that it would be inconceivable now, and after something like the Iranian embassy siege, to have got rid of them. But it took a long time, and it took a change of mindsets and a realization of the appreciation of what special forces soldiering can bring to the military and a nation in its entirety. And that certainly didn't happen during the war. I mean, bear in mind, during the war, they got very, very little publicity, almost nothing.
No. And is that partly to do with official secrecy or power struggles, or is it that, British wartime journalism didn't know how to tell that story?
It's more the fact that very, very few, British or American journalists had access to what they were doing. I mean, how could you have access to what they were doing? Unless you wanted to parachute in, like D-Day, unless you wanted to parachute in and join a bunch of 12 guys parachuting deep behind the lines and risk a suicide operation. It's very hard to report on what they were doing. Mm-hmm. In August 44, Paddy Main's in Paris, the battle. The post-D-Day battles are pretty much won. They've been very successful, and he meets up with a Reader's Digest journalist. Actually, it's the Reader's Digest that is one of the first publications that actually tells the story of the SAS and calls them that by name. And he wanted that to happen because canny individual that he was, he realized that official recognition for those men taking those unbelievable risks was actually important to them.
Mhm.
Because if you just saw other units getting all the credit all the time, imagine what that did to your morale. It
Yeah.
was very, very hard for journalists to get access to those kind of stories.
And just, I guess, as a final question, I mean, David Sterling's post-war life is quite well publicized, but what some of the other guys, what did they do when they were demobbed?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, getting demobbed for these guys in particular was actually traumatic in the extreme. So I've just finished writing my second book on it's kind of, Blair Paddy Mayne and his band of warriors. So the first was SAS Brothers in Arms, and this one's called SAS Forged in Hell. It comes out in October. And I had the manuscript, the first manuscript and this one read by a PTSD specialist called Ros Townsend, who's fantastic.
Right.
And she said to me, look, she said, any one of these missions is enough to give you enough trauma to have PTSD. 5 years of back-to-back behind enemy lines missions, it's inconceivable you wouldn't have it. But she said, most importantly of all, you can keep the trauma at bay when you're with your band of brothers, because you've got a greater mission to strive for. And that greater mission to strive for means you can kind of bury it. You can bury it with camaraderie. You can bury it with drinking the mesh. You can bury it with the next mission. But she said, you take away that bigger purpose. You take away the identity that melds them all together.
Agree.
It surfaces very quickly. And she says the worst way you could have done that was what they did in October 45. And then literally just had a parade and said, right, you're all either going to be returned to your units or sent back to Civvy Street. We're being disbanded. And that was it. And so many of these individuals, I'm very sad to say, like Bill Fraser, the guy I mentioned in the first escape story, he led a life of alcoholism. He was on the streets at times and died an early death, as did Paddy Mayne. So a lot of these individuals, huge number of these individuals were really, really traumatized and suffered terribly.
There was I did some work at RAF Duxford many years ago now, but got to speak to former Lancaster crews, a couple of surviving guys. And again, as you put it, the level of suicides between 1945 and about 1948. People dying very young of things like tuberculosis, because the messes they were in were and the planes were health hazards, alcoholism, mental illness. I mean, you imagine what flying as a tail end Charlie in one of those things was like. But it's to do with how they were disbanded, and following things like the Dresden raid. Suddenly they're an embarrassment, and we don't want to talk about Bomber Command. Just kicked out, thrown out on their ear. Really, it's a disgraceful way to treat people. So I guess there's a whole unwritten history of war trauma. But probably for someone else to write, I think, if not me. It really is instructive to hear these stories and to just to appreciate what it must have been like for people to go through that experience. Okay, so we need to finish up in just a moment, but the book is available now, is that right?
Yes, so it is Thursday, so tomorrow, yeah.
Okay, fab. So I'll put as soon as it's available, I'll put a link in the podcast to the book, available in all good retailers. Try not to buy from Amazon if you can, folks, and support your local bookshop. Damien, it's been an absolute pleasure. When the next book comes out, would you be happy to pop back and have another chat with us?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. My pleasure. Obviously. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, fab. Well, I'll let you know when the podcast goes live. And thanks you so much for coming on.
Yeah, sure. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.